Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales. Today, I want to share a story about loss, love, and the courage it takes to keep living when the world around you has gone cold. It's called When the Snow Stopped Falling. The year was 1887. Out on the far edges of Montana Territory, where winter didn't just visit, it stayed. Snow had been falling for days, thick and soundless, covering the land like a shroud. If you stood out there long enough, you'd swear even God had stopped whispering. Inside a small cabin, tucked between two frozen hills, one lamp still burned. Its glow reached only so far, pushing back the dark like a weary hand against a rising tide. That light belonged to Elias Ward, a man who'd been widowed 3 winters ago and hadn't yet found his way out of the grief. He moved through the room the way a man does when he's memorized every inch of silence. The coffee on the stove was cold. The chair by the fire had dust on one armrest. Smooth on the other, where a woman's hand used to rest. Her name had been Anna, and though she was gone, her presence lingered in every corner, the faded quilt she'd sewn, the small tin cup she favored, the lullaby Elias couldn't bear to hear his daughter hum. Abby, 6 years old, stirred from her bed in the loft. Her dark hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed from sleep. She peered down through the railing, her small voice soft and uncertain. "Papa," she asked, "will Mama come for Christmas this time?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elias turned from the fire, his eyes hollow beneath the lamplight. He wanted to lie, to tell her something kind and easy, but the truth hung too heavy on his tongue. "Best get some sleep now, little one," he said instead. "Morning comes early." She lingered another moment, her small hands gripping the wood rail. "But you said maybe sleep, Abby." His voice was gentle, but firm, the kind of tone that ends a conversation without resolving it. The child disappeared beneath her blankets, leaving only the sound of her breathing and the soft whistle of wind through the chinks in the cabin wall. Elias sat down in his chair, the one across from the empty one, and stared at the fire. Outside, the storm howled, but inside it was worse. Inside was the kind of quiet that remembers every heartbeat that used to fill it. He thought of Anna's laugh, the way it could chase shadows right out of a room. He thought of her hand on his arm the night she said, "We'll be fine. Eli, God watches over us." He'd believed her then, but she'd died bringing their second child into the world, and the child had gone with her. Since that night, he'd stopped listening to preachers and quit arguing with heaven. Sometimes he spoke to her picture when Abby wasn't around. "Snow's come early again," he'd mutter. "You always said it looked pure." "Never looked pure to me, just empty." He reached over and touched the back of her chair, worn smooth from years of use. The wood was cold under his fingers. "I'm trying, Anna," he whispered, "but I don't know how to do this without you." The wind pressed against the cabin walls, a low moan that might have been sorrow, might have been the mountain itself breathing. The lamp flickered. The night stretched on. Morning brought no mercy. The snow was deeper, the sky a dull gray that promised more. Elias chopped wood out back while Abby drew horses in the ash near the hearth. He didn't talk much anymore, and she'd learned not to expect it. When he came in, shaking snow from his coat, she held up one of her drawings. "This one's Mama's horse," she said proudly. "Do you think she still rides in heaven?" Elias paused, axe still in hand. "I reckon she does," he said after a moment. She always loved to ride. The girl smiled, satisfied with that answer, and went back to drawing. By afternoon, the storm thickened. The wind carried the kind of cold that burned the lungs, and the snow swirled so hard a man could lose his way between the barn and the porch. Elias stoked the fire higher than usual and set another log by the stove. He poured coffee he wouldn't drink, stared out the small window at a world buried in white. Then a sound, a dull, heavy knock against the cabin door. Once, then again, he froze, hand halfway to his rifle. Out here, a knock in a storm could mean trouble, or need, often both. Abby looked up, wide-eyed. "Papa?" Elias motioned her back. He stepped slowly to the door, lifted the latch, and opened it against the wind. There, framed by the snow and darkness, stood a woman. Her hair was soaked, her coat crusted with frost. She looked about 30, maybe younger, eyes sharp, lips blue from cold. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, voice trembling but steady. "My horse went lame. The storm came faster than I thought." For a moment, Elias didn't speak. The sight of another living soul felt foreign, almost dreamlike. Then he stepped aside. "Get in before you freeze solid." The woman hesitated just a second, long enough to show she understood what it meant to cross another person's threshold uninvited, then stepped in. Warmth hit her face, and she shivered hard, clutching her coat closed. Abby peeked from behind her father's leg. Curious as a sparrow, the woman managed a tired smile. "My name's Clara Morgan." Elias nodded. "Elias Ward. This here's my daughter, Abby." Abby took a small step forward, eyes wide. "Are you going to stay for Christmas?" Elias frowned. "Abby," but the woman smiled again, softer this time. "I hadn't planned on it," she said, "but the Lord might have other ideas." Elias moved to the stove, poured her a cup of that cold coffee, reheated it with a splash of hot water. "Your horse, in the drift about a mile back, lame on the front leg." He nodded. "I'll fetch it after the wind dies down. For now, you'd best sit close to the fire." She did. The room filled with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. He moved through the room the way a man does when he's memorized every inch of silence. The coffee on the stove was cold. The chair by the fire had dust on one armrest, smooth on the other where a woman's hand used to rest. Her name had been Anna, and though she was gone, her presence lingered in every corner, the faded quilt she'd sewn, the small tin cup she favored, the lullaby Elias couldn't bear to hear his daughter hum. And though none of them said it, something shifted in that quiet little room. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in 3 long winters, the silence began to break. And that's where our story truly begins, with one man, one child, and a stranger at the door, each carrying their own kind of sorrow, each about to learn that even in the coldest places on earth, there are things that can still thaw. The woman who stepped through Elias Ward's door that night looked half ghost, half grit, the kind of person you could tell had seen her share of hard roads. Her name was Clara Morgan, and she carried herself like someone who'd been alone long enough to forget what safety felt like. Snow still clung to her lashes as she pulled the door closed behind her. Her hands were shaking, but her voice wasn't. "My horse went lame," she said, breath clouding in the lamplight. "I was headed for Wyoming. The storm caught me off guard." Abby studied her every move, the way her hands trembled, the way she warmed them near the flame. It had been a long time since another woman sat by that fire. She stepped closer to the fire, her boots leaving small pools of melting snow on the floorboards. Up close, he saw the cut on her cheek, the way her knuckles were scraped raw. She'd been through more than a bad storm. But Elias didn't ask, and she didn't offer. Behind him, Abby had crept down from the loft, her eyes wide, curious as a fawn's. The child studied Clara the way children do, with open trust and no judgment at all. Elias just nodded. Out here. You didn't waste words when the cold was still biting at your bones. Come in, he said, before it kills you. Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. He hadn't planned on company, not for Christmas. Not for any day since Anna died. Clara noticed the tension, the way the man guarded his space like a wounded animal. She eased herself onto the chair nearest the fire. Not quite sitting. More like testing if she was allowed to. Her fingers stretched toward the warmth. After a moment, she looked up. I can cook, she said quietly. If you've got a bit of flour and salt, maybe I can make myself useful. Papa, Abby whispered, tugging at his sleeve. Is she gonna stay? Elias hesitated. That kitchen had belonged to Anna. Her apron still hung by the door. Her recipe book still sat on the shelf, untouched for 3 years. He almost said no, but then he caught sight of Abby, standing there barefoot on the cold floor, eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in too long. Hope. It wasn't pride that made her offer, it was gratitude. The old kind. The kind that comes from knowing kindness is never owed. While Clara moved about the kitchen, Abby followed her every step. She handed her spoons, asked questions, hummed little songs. And though the woman's hands were trembling from the cold, she smiled through it, a soft, tired smile that reached her eyes. Elias sat by the window, pretending to mend a bridle strap, though his gaze drifted back to them again and again. It was strange hearing another woman's laughter in that house. Not loud or careless, just small and real, blending with the crackle of fire and the sound of a child's voice. For the first time in 3 winters, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The storm outside beat hard against the walls, but inside, the world began to thaw. Clara peeled off her wet coat and hung it near the stove. Steam rose from it like a spirit leaving the flesh. Abby giggled at the sight. Looks like your coat's cooking too, Clara laughed. And Elias caught himself smiling before he could stop it. He rose and took his own coat down from the peg. I'll see to your horse, he said. If it's still standing, it deserves a warm stall. She started to protest. You don't have to, but he cut her off. Out here, we look after the living. He cleared his throat. There's flour in the barrel, potatoes in the cellar. Then he turned away, busying himself with the fire. When Elias returned an hour later, his beard crusted with frost, Clara had managed to set a simple meal on the table. A small roast, potatoes, a few hard biscuits softened in gravy. The smell filled the room with something that felt dangerously close to home. Abby was already seated, bouncing in her chair. Papa, she made Christmas supper look. Elias looked. He hadn't seen a table set like that since Anna's last Christmas. Even the old tin plates seemed cleaner, brighter under the lamp's glow. You didn't have to trouble yourself, he said, voice low. Clara shook her head. It's no trouble. Feels good to cook again. She waited for him to sit, but when he didn't, she took her own seat quietly, hands folded, as if uncertain of her place. They ate mostly in silence. Only Abby talked about her drawings, about the horses she'd seen in town, about how Mama used to bake gingerbread that made the whole cabin smell like cinnamon. Every time she said Mama, Clara's eyes flicked to Elias's face, watching how he flinched, how his jaw tightened just a little. He didn't stop Abby, though he never did. Halfway through the meal, Clara looked around the room, the bare walls, the dusty mantel where a single photograph sat framed in wood. A young woman, smiling, her arm around Elias. Anna. Clara didn't touch the picture, but she whispered softly, as if to herself. She was lovely. Elias looked up sharply. She was, he said after a moment, too lovely for this place. The words hung between them, heavy as the snow outside. Then Abby giggled again, breaking the tension. Papa? You're not eating. Miss Clara worked hard. Elias blinked, then reached for his fork. You're right. Little one. He took a bite and something in him eased. Just a fraction. The food was simple, but warm, honest. It tasted like the world before loss. After supper, Clara gathered the dishes. Elias started to protest. You're our guest, she shook her head. Let me? It helps me feel normal again. He let her. When she was done, Abby climbed into her lap, sleepy but happy, asking questions about where she came from and where she was going. Cheyenne, Clara said softly. My sister's ranch. If I can get there. Why? Abby asked. Clara hesitated. Because sometimes people need a place to start over. The child thought about that, then nodded solemnly. Maybe you can start over here. Elias, standing by the fire, froze. Clara met his eyes for a moment, a flicker of understanding. A quiet question she didn't voice. He turned away. Bedtime. Abby, the little girl sighed but obeyed, climbing the loft ladder one step at a time. Good night. Miss Clara. She called down. Good night. Sweetheart, when it was just the two of them. The silence returned, not the hollow kind, but something gentler, expectant. Elias stirred the fire, his face lit by its orange glow. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap. Finally, she said, thank you for letting me in. Many wouldn't have. He didn't look at her. Storm like that. No decent man could turn someone away. Clara smiled faintly. Decent men are rarer than good weather. That made him glance up. Their eyes met just long enough for both to look away again. Outside, the wind began to die. The storm that had howled for 2 days softened to a whisper. In the firelight, the cabin glowed with quiet warmth. 3 souls beneath one roof, each broken in different ways, each beginning to remember what it meant to feel alive. And so, the strangers stayed the night, while the snow piled high and the world beyond their door disappeared. No one spoke of tomorrow. No one dared. But in that small cabin, something fragile had begun to stir, a flicker of compassion in a place that had forgotten how to feel it. And for the first time in 3 long winters, Elias Ward didn't dread the sound of another voice beside the fire. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it almost rang. The sky stretched pale and wide, and the snow outside the cabin glittered like ground glass. Inside, everything looked the same, except it wasn't. Clara Morgan was still there. Her horse, Elias discovered, had strained a tendon. It would be a week before it could travel again. So, she stayed. She didn't ask permission, and Elias didn't forbid it. Somehow, the decision just hung there between them, unspoken but understood. At first, she kept to herself, but over the next few days, she began to move through the cabin like someone gently waking a sleeping house. She swept the floor, hummed while she worked, mended a torn curtain that had been hanging crooked for months. Elias came in one afternoon to find a bunch of sage and lavender tied with twine, drying near the window. He stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to thank her or tell her to leave things be. She turned, smiling just enough to disarm his caution. Figured a little color wouldn't hurt. She said. He grunted something like agreement, hung his coat, and went back outside. But when he came in that evening, the scent of sage greeted him again, and for the first time in 3 years. The cabin didn't smell like grief. It smelled like life. Abby had taken to following Clara everywhere. She'd trail after her from room to room, talking, laughing, asking questions without pause. And Clara, patient as rain, always answered. "Miss Clara," Abby said one morning, "do you know how to make cookies like Mama used to?" Clara thought for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe not like your Mama's, but we can try." She rolled up her sleeves, tied on Anna's old apron, and set to work. When Elias came in from chopping wood, the kitchen was full of flour, dust, and laughter. Abby stood on a stool, stirring a bowl half her size, her hair dusted white as snow. Elias froze in the doorway. That apron, that laughter. For a second, the past and the present collided so hard he could hardly breathe. Clara looked up, reading his face before he spoke. "I hope you don't mind," she said gently. She wanted to bake. He swallowed, voice rough. "Not at all." Then he stepped back outside before the tears could show. Later that night, Clara found him in the barn, mending a broken harness strap. He didn't look up when she entered. "Abby's asleep," she said softly. "Cookies turned out fine." He nodded. After a long silence, she spoke again. "She talks about her mother a lot. She should." Elias said, "It's how she remembers." Clara leaned against a post, arms folded. "I envy her. You know, children carry grief differently. It doesn't hollow them out the way it does us." He looked up at her then, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. Maybe because they still believe love doesn't die. Her gaze softened. "And you don't, Elias, Seahead." Setting the strap aside. "I used to believe it. Then I buried a wife and a child in the same week." She didn't answer, didn't offer pity or words of comfort, just stood there, sharing the silence until it felt less heavy. The days slipped by, quiet and slow. Snow melted from the trees, dripping steady as a clock. The icicles along the eaves caught the light like crystal blades, thinning by the hour. Inside, something else was thawing too. Clara had started reading to Abby by the fire each night, a habit that pulled Elias into the room without him realizing it. He'd sit in his chair, pretending to whittle or check his tools. But really he was just listening. Her voice was calm and warm, the kind that made even sorrow sound like a promise. Sometimes, when Abby drifted off to sleep, they'd sit there in silence. Two adults bound by what they'd both lost. One night, Clara broke that silence. "I thought moving would make the pain fade," she said, her voice low, eyes on the fire. "But it just followed me. Every mile, every new town, it was still there, waiting." Elias stared into the flames. Standing still didn't make mine fade either. Clara turned her head slightly. So, you just stayed here, in the same place she died. Where else would I go, he said. Every trail leads away from her. I wasn't ready to leave her behind? Clara nodded slowly. I understand that. Another long pause. The fire popped, throwing sparks up the chimney. Then Elias asked quietly, "And your husband, how long's he been gone?" She hesitated, hands folded in her lap. 2 years. Ranch accident. We'd been married 5. I'm sorry, he said. She smiled faintly, but her eyes shimmered. So was I. The wind moaned outside the cabin, a long, low sound that seemed to echo through them both. Elias spoke again, softer now. I used to think grief was a kind of faith. If I held onto it tight enough, it meant she mattered. But it's not faith. It's just fear wearing a church coat. Clara looked up sharply, surprised by his honesty. Fear of what? Of letting go. Of waking up one morning and realizing I can't remember her voice. Clara reached out then, not to touch him, but just to bridge the space between them. I don't think letting go means forgetting. It means making room. Grief and love can share the same heart. Elias. You just have to let them. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The firelight flickered across their faces, 2 people. Different scars. Same ache. Outside, a small chunk of snow slid from the roof and fell with a dull thud. The icicles by the window began to drip. Steady and rhythmic, spring was still months away. But the first thaw had begun. Abby woke briefly in the loft above, listening to the murmurs below, the soft rise and fall of 2 grown-up voices that didn't sound sad anymore. Just human. She smiled, half asleep, and whispered to herself, "Miss Clara laughs like Mama used to." Then she drifted back into dreams. The sound of fire crackle carrying her there. Out there in the Montana wild, change didn't come fast. It crept in quiet, like sunlight after storm clouds, or warmth returning to a frozen hand. But that week, inside Elias Ward's cabin, something small but mighty had begun to move. A woman mending curtains, a child's laughter returning, a man learning how to breathe again. No one called it love yet. But even love has to start somewhere, and most times, it starts with kindness, and the courage to let another soul stay a while longer than you planned. For a little while, peace held steady in the Ward cabin. The days had rhythm again, small, ordinary moments that felt almost like grace. Clara's horse healed slowly, and no one hurried the process. Elias split wood in the mornings. Clara cooked or read with Abby, and the evenings ended by firelight, the kind that felt earned after years of cold. Outside, the land stayed frozen, but inside, warmth had taken root, fragile, quiet, unspoken. Until the day the Whitakers came calling. They showed up just past noon, their wagon creaking under the weight of neighborly goodwill. Thomas Whitaker was a big man with opinions to match his size, and his wife Ellen had a smile sharp enough to cut ice. Elias met them on the porch. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and part of him was almost glad for company. The other part, the wiser part, wished he'd pretended not to be home. Elias Ward Thomas boomed, stepping down from the wagon. "We thought we'd stop by. Ellen baked a pie for you and the young one." Ellen followed, clutching a basket covered in cloth. Her eyes darted toward the stable. The door left half open, and then to the window where Clara's shadow moved across the curtain. "How kind of you." Elias said, "You didn't have to come all this way." "Oh, nonsense," Ellen replied, her tone sweet as syrup. "We couldn't let Christmas go by without checking in. It gets awful lonely out here for folks, especially widowers." Elias felt the air change. A man who'd lived long in silence could hear judgment coming before it spoke its name. Inside, Clara had paused her mending, watching from behind the curtain. She knew that look, that whisper the kind women got when they didn't fit where others thought they should. Abby stood beside her, confused. "Who are they?" the child asked. "Neighbors," Clara said softly. "The kind who mean well until they don't." Elias invited the Whitakers in. Out of courtesy more than desire, he set out coffee while Ellen placed her pie neatly on the table, glancing around the cabin like she was taking inventory of sin. "So," she said after a while, "we heard a woman's been staying here. Imagine our surprise." Thomas chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Not that anyone's prying, Elias, but folks talk. You know how it is." Elias's hands tightened around his coffee cup. Her horse went lame in the storm. She's waiting for it to heal. "Of course," Ellen said, smiling. "That's what we told everyone. Still, people can be curious, especially with a young daughter in the house." The words landed like a slap. Abby. That was the lever they always used. Clara stepped out from the kitchen before Elias could respond. Her chin was high, her expression calm, though color had risen in her cheeks. "I'm the woman folks are talking about," she said evenly. "And I'm grateful for Mr. Ward's kindness. Nothing more." Ellen blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Well," she said quickly, "we meant no harm. Just times being what they are. Appearances do matter." Thomas added, "It's the way of things. Elias, a man's got to think about his reputation, his daughter's future." Elias stood, his jaw set. "Appreciate the visit," he said, "but I think it's time you were on your way." Ellen rose, flustered, muttering something about just being neighborly. The door closed behind them with a thud that seemed to echo through every corner of the house. For a long time, no one spoke. Clara busied herself with folding her work, her face unreadable. Elias felt anger boiling under his skin, anger at the Whitakers, at the town, at the whole damn world that refused to leave a wounded man alone. But beneath that anger was something colder, fear. He turned toward Clara finally, voice low. "You know how people are. They'll twist kindness into sin soon enough." Clara didn't look at him. "Let them. Truth doesn't change because people gossip. Truth won't protect Abby from their talk." At her name, Clara's hands stilled. She looked up, eyes sharp now. "So that's it. You'd rather live in fear of what they think than let that little girl see what kindness looks like." Elias didn't answer. His silence said enough. That evening, as the sun bled red across the snow, he found Clara in the barn tending her horse. She brushed the animal with slow, deliberate strokes. "When it's ready," he said quietly, "you should move on." Clara froze, the brush midair. "I see. It's not that I—" He stopped himself. "It's for Abby's sake. For your own, too. Folks, ill talk." She turned to him then, her face pale but steady. "People will always talk, Elias. But it's you who has to live with the silence after I'm gone." The words hit him like a blow. Before he could speak again, Abby's voice came from behind the barn door. She'd been standing there, listening, small shoulders shaking. Her mittens clutched tight in her hands. "Papa," she said, stepping into the light. Elias's heart dropped. "Abby, it's late. Go inside." But she didn't move. Her eyes were wet, fierce. "You're sending Miss Clara away." He hesitated. "It's complicated." "No, it's not." Her little voice trembled, but her words came clear as glass. "Mama said love makes more love, not less. You're just scared." Elias blinked. Stunned, silent, children had a way of cutting straight through where adults built walls. Abby turned and ran back toward the house before he could answer. Night fell hard and cold. The cabin was quiet again, too quiet. Abby had cried herself to sleep upstairs. Clara stayed in the barn with her horse, and Elias sat alone by the fire, staring at the empty chair across from him, Anna's chair. The lamplight flickered, and the house seemed to breathe around him, heavy with ghosts and memories. He thought of all the years he'd spent guarding this silence, keeping grief like a pet that only he could feed. And now, when life had dared to come knocking again, he'd sent it away because a few tongues in town couldn't keep still. He ran a hand over his face, rough with days of neglect. The fire cracked, a coal falling to ash. Maybe Abby was right. Maybe he was scared, not of the gossip, not even of sin or shame, but of happiness. Because once you let it in, you had something to lose again. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the flames. Outside, the wind had risen. It hissed against the walls like judgment. And in the chair opposite him, the shadows shifted for just a moment. He could almost see Anna there. "Watching?" he whispered into the emptiness. "What would you have me do?" But the silence gave no answer. Only the soft groan of timbers and the steady rhythm of snow against glass. Out on the frontier, loneliness could drive a man to madness, but fear could make him cruel. And that night, Elias Ward learned which one he carried heavier. He'd built his whole life on the belief that keeping still meant staying safe, but safety, he was starting to see, was just another kind of prison. In the morning, the snow would fall again, and the cabin that had begun to feel like home would return to silence. But silence, as Elias was beginning to learn, was not the same as peace. The next morning broke cold and clear, the kind of morning that makes every shadow look sharper, every regret feel heavier. Elias had not slept. He'd sat by the fire all night, staring at embers as they turned to ash, listening to the silence that had once been his companion, now turned against him. Abby's soft breathing came from the loft above. Outside, the world was white again, washed clean, though he felt anything but. And somewhere beyond that calm, he knew Clara Morgan was already making ready to leave. By midday, a sound of wheels crunching over snow pulled him from his thoughts. A wagon stopped at the gate, and the familiar voices of Samuel and Ruth Dwyer drifted through the still air. They were old friends, the kind who didn't come with judgment, only truth. Ruth's voice carried first. "Elias Ward, you hiding in there? Or you planning to let folks freeze on your porch?" He opened the door, managing the faintest smile. "You're braver than the weather. Always have been," Samuel said, stepping down stiffly. "We brought some preserves." And something else. Ruth reached into her shawl and pulled out a small, sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges with time. She held it like it was fragile or sacred. "Your wife gave me this," she said. "The day Abby was born, she made me promise to give it to you if things ever got too quiet." Her eyes softened. Looks to me like they have. Elias froze, staring at the letter as though it were a ghost made flesh. He took it with hands that trembled despite the cold. "Thank you," he said. It was all he could manage. The Dwyers didn't linger. They knew better than to stand between a man and his reckonings. When the wagon rolled away, its tracks cut long and deep across the snow, a road that led out, and maybe, one day, back. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. Elias sat at the table, turning the envelope over in his hands. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable Anna's, careful and looping, with one small ink blot where she'd paused too long on his name. He read the words she'd written across the seal. If things ever get too quiet, they had God. They had. His thumb slid under the flap. The paper tore softly, like the breath of a ghost. Inside was one page, faded but clear. He read it once. Then again the words, cutting through the years as if no time had passed at all. "My dearest Elias, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. And if I didn't, please know this loving me was never a mistake. Even if it ends in sorrow, love is still the best thing we ever do. Promise me you won't let grief become your home. Promise me you'll let Abby see what it looks like when her father lives. Not just survives. Let someone love her when I can't. And let someone love you, even if it scares you. My heart was big enough to love you forever. Yours is big enough to love again. Don't let fear win. Choose life. Choose love. Choose hope. Forever yours. Anna." The words blurred as tears hit the page, staining the ink. He pressed the letter to his chest and bowed his head. The sound that came from him rough and raw, half sob, half prayer. All the years he'd spent punishing himself for surviving, she had never asked that of him. She'd only ever asked him to live. The light outside was fading when Elias finally rose. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his coat pocket, and stepped out into the sharp air. The snow burned his lungs as he breathed it in. And for the first time in years, that burn felt good, like proof he was still here. The barn was quiet, save for the soft sound of a horse shifting in its stall. Clara was there, her back to him, packing her saddle with slow, deliberate care. The lamplight traced the curve of her shoulder, the tired grace of someone used to leaving before she was left. He stood there for a moment, just watching, the letter still clutched in his fist. "Clara," he said finally. She turned, surprise flickering across her face. "I was going to say goodbye," she said. "Didn't seem right to just go without. Ruth Dwyer brought me a letter." He interrupted, his voice thick. "From Anna? She wrote it before she died." Clara's eyes softened. "What did it say?" He drew a breath, the kind that comes before truth. "She told me not to let grief be my home. Said I should let someone love Abby when she couldn't." He swallowed hard. "She said I should let someone love me, too, even if it scared me." Silence stretched between them, long and fragile. Then Clara spoke, her voice quiet. "Wise woman, you're Anna." Elias nodded. "Too wise for me. Took me 3 years to hear her." He stepped closer, the letter still warm in his hand. "I've spent so long building walls, calling it faithfulness. But it was just fear. I was afraid that loving again meant betraying her." He shook his head. "But she already forgave me, before I even failed." Clara's gaze dropped to the ground. "I don't want to take her place." Elias. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded letter, and held it between them. No one ever could, but she didn't ask me to forget her. She asked me to live. And I think living means not standing here watching you ride away. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint warmth that didn't belong to winter. Elias looked up at the pale horizon, streaked with gold, where the sun was fighting its way back through the clouds. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking backward. The past would always live in that cabin in the laughter. The loss, the memory of a love that had once filled every inch of it. But now, there was room for something else. Too, he turned back to Clara, his voice steady, almost calm. I don't know what comes next, but I know I'm done running from it. Sometimes it takes the dead to remind the living how to breathe again. Sometimes it takes a letter carried through years of silence to say what a heart's been waiting to hear. That day, Elias Ward stopped being a ghost in his own home. He'd read his wife's final words and found they weren't about endings at all. They were about beginnings, the kind that start quiet, under falling snow, when a man finally chooses life over fear. And out there, in that wide Montana morning, the thaw began for good. The sun was barely over the ridge when Elias Ward stepped out into the cold. Snow sparkled like powdered glass across the fields, and every breath came out white as smoke. In the barn, he could hear the soft shuffle of hooves, the low creak of leather, the sound of someone getting ready to leave. Clara Morgan was saddling her horse. Her coat was buttoned, her hat pulled low, her eyes fixed on the road that would take her away. She didn't look up when Elias entered. Though she must have heard him, he stood there a long moment, trying to find words big enough to carry what he needed to say. The letter from Anna still weighed in his pocket, heavy as truth. Clara, he said at last. She stopped what she was doing but didn't turn. I told myself this was the right thing. He went on, voice low, letting you go, keeping the world quiet, keeping Abby safe. But it's not the right thing. It's just the easy thing. She turned then, eyes steady but sad. Elias, don't. But he did. I built a prison out of love, thinking it was loyalty. But love isn't a grave, he said, his voice rough but sure. It's a seed. And you helped me see that. For the first time, Clara's composure cracked. Her hand trembled where it rested on the saddle horn. She looked at him as if weighing every word he'd ever said and every one he hadn't. He took a slow step closer. I was afraid, he said. Afraid that moving on meant forgetting Anna. But it doesn't. She'll always be here, he touched his chest. And somehow, so are you. Both of you. Different, but not competing. Just growing from the same root. The barn filled with silence. Snow fell softly through the cracks in the roof, melting as it landed. Clara's eyes glistened. Not from the cold. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. If I stay for keeps. Elias nodded once. Then stay for keeps. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise, quiet, certain. The kind that only means something when a person's learned how to lose. For a heartbeat. Neither of them moved. Then Clara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but the warmth between them was real simple. Human. Alive. Outside, a small voice broke through the stillness. Papa! Abby was running across the snow, her coat half-buttoned, her hair wild from sleep. She stopped at the barn door, cheeks red from the wind. eyes wide with joy. 3 fits better than 2. Papa, she said breathlessly. Elias laughed. The sound startled and free, like a door swinging open after years of rust. He lifted her into his arms, and she wrapped her small hands around his neck. Clara smiled through tears, laying a hand on the child's back. For the first time in a long while, the world felt right-sized again, not too big, not too empty, just full enough to hold them all. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to change. Slowly, gently, life returned, not as a flood, but as a quiet, rising tide. The cabin smelled of bread again. Herbs hung drying by the window. Laughter small, hesitant at first, filled the corners where grief used to echo. Anna's photograph stayed right where it had always been, on the mantel beside the lamp. Clara placed a small keepsake beside it, a pressed wildflower from her journey west. 2 lives, 2 loves, side by side, not competing, not erasing, but belonging. In the evenings, Elias would sit by the fire, Abby curled in his lap, Clara mending by the light. Sometimes he'd catch himself watching them, and for once, he didn't feel guilty for smiling. Out the window, the snow began to soften and sink, giving way to patches of earth. The first thaw of spring, the world moving on, as it always does, waiting for those brave enough to move with it. One afternoon, Abby called from the yard. Papa, Miss Clara, come see. They stepped outside to find 3 snow angels stretched across the field. One small, one slender, one broad-shouldered. The child beamed. One for each of us, she said proudly. The setting sun spilled gold across the drifts, and the angels glowed, bright against the fading light. Elias looked down at Clara, then up toward the sky, whispering under his breath, "Thank you, Anna, for loving us enough to let us go forward." And so the story ends where it began, in the snow. Only now, the snow is different. It no longer buries. It blankets. It no longer silences. It softens. Where once there was winter, now there was warmth. Where once there was one, now there were 3. And in the quiet between earth and heaven, love multiplied. The lamp in the window burned steady through the night, a small light against the endless white. And somewhere far above, a woman's spirit smiled. Her promise kept that love, once planted, never truly dies. And that, my friends, was When the Snow Stopped Falling, a story about loss, grace, and the courage to start again. If this tale found a place in your heart, tell me down in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what part spoke to you most? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story from the frontier. Because out here on Western Tales, every heart's got a trail worth following.